learns a lot. Being an immigrant and being one of those data points in there, it's sort of a personalized experience to see the numbers. There were a few things that I think which stood out to me. One is the 1965 Immigration Act. Right. In terms of the benefits or net effects on India, do you think that that Immigration Act or that allowing more people, non-Europeans, to come into the country, into the U.S., was it a net detrimental effect on India?
In some ways, it's a totally unanswerable question because we have to think of the counterfactual. Yeah. Right. If you remember that in India, mid-60s and 70s was India's worst economic decade, and having large numbers of people, educated people with nothing to do, could have led to a lot of political frustration, and who knows what that would have meant. So it's very, the problem with looking at migration and its effects on the sending country is we don't know what the counterfactual would have been. Right. Exactly. What would have happened had they not left? Yeah. And that's why it's very hard to come up with a bottom line. I mean, a simple but banal answer is, well, there were some pluses and some minuses. But, how do you net it out is much harder.
Because the earlier migration, which is the 18th and 19th century, where you see those migrants were primarily indentured laborers. Right. So that India has an abundance. Right. So that
the one where we are more confident of being unequivocally good for India is the migration here to the Gulf, which is about 9 million. Because they are all low skilled. That's labor migration. Right. And basically, so whenever there's international migration, right, three groups are affected: the migrant herself, the receiving country, and the sending country. Right. Almost no one migrates unless there is some gain to be made. Right. The maximum gains of moving are for low skill, because low skill, the gap in wages is much higher. So when low-skilled people move from India to work in the Gulf, those wage gains for them are substantial. The Gulf doesn't allow you to live there, so most of them, or all of them, not most, or everyone moves back. So that, I think, has been unequivocally positive for the migrant, their families, and so on. The ones to the US, like for reasons I've stated, is that's a mixed bag. There are many, many positive things, but there are things that may not have been as beneficial to India. I mean, we are in a university. If this university loses its best faculty and joins another university, it would be hard to say that it's great for this university, right? Because the university is made, it thrives when you have talented people.
The other thing which was very noticeable is the significant difference in FDI, the foreign direct investment. If you noted the numbers for China versus India,
right?
Are there reasons that we can think
of? That of course has to do with partly the domestic investment regime in the two countries, the ease of doing business and so on. But the fact is, the Indian diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, Taiwan especially, Taiwan, if you remember, by the 80s was a major manufacturing success. It was one of the 4 Asian tigers and so on and so forth. So wages had begun to rise. So most of the Taiwanese had family connections across the straits in southern China. So for them to move their factories to southern China to take advantage of much lower wages was not hard. They had the experience, and the same from Hong Kong. Hong Kong was there in part. Whereas there were no, the Indian diaspora never had strengths in manufacturing, wherever it was located. At that time it was US, UK, and the Gulf. And they just weren't taking into manufacturing. So there was no skill they could transfer back.
It's kind of ironic that the impact of, in the 18th century, India at that time was considered to be a manufacturing powerhouse in the contemporary technology at that time. And but in a couple of hundred years, we had lost all of the advantages that were there.
Right. I mean, it's a bit like if you look at work, if you're doing 19 to 20, the US was the world's manufacturing powerhouse. In 100 years, it's lost a lot of that. Right? That's why they're having this sort of politics, trying to bring manufacturing back, the tariffs of Trump, etc. But the boat has sailed. The boat has sailed for India as well.
Now, there is a recent trend which we have noticed in some of the engineering programs and in business schools, that the number of new Ph.D. students who are applying to different programs has dropped significantly from India.
Right. And that's what I showed you, that stagnation of PhD. There's an element of good news and bad news. The good news is that many are going for the tech startup space, and so they don't see any point in doing a PhD. But at the same time, it might also reflect the fact that the training is no longer as good to be able to compete in the very competitive PhD market. So we don't know the exact story and reason.
Is that true for the medical students as well? I do not know.
That's, there were fewer medical students doing PhDs in any case. The biological sciences have done reasonably better compared to the past because of a number of institutions. So the best place to look for that is NIH data, because NIH, until a month ago, was the place for training postdocs, and very large numbers came from there. But I don't know what will happen now.
The other thing which I noted, which I thought was very interesting, was your observation about the Y2K and the year 2000, when we were all concerned about the Y2K and the upswing that you noticed from that. But it seems to have been sustained.
Right. I mean, partly the Y2K allowed American companies to see that this group had talent, could do this. So in software and in service, reputation matters a lot. And so it had to build a reputation.
There have been recent news reports about the flights, the flights carrying the illegal immigrants, the ones from India back to India. Is there any kind of information available in terms of what these people who have stayed on, who are illegal now, what was their income or education or whatever level?
No, that's very good. See, all the data I've shown you is US census. And the census, by definition, the census never asks your visa status. It's not allowed to. Because if you ask the visa status, people will not answer your questions. I think what you see is the Wall Street Journal had an article last week basically saying that each of those flights cost $3 million. So the US spent in in 3 flights it deported barely 400 people, and each flight was $3 million. You are not going to do too many of these flights at that cost, right? So a lot of this is not about, in my opinion, about sending back large numbers of people, but the deterrent effect to show what might happen to prevent future illegal migration from India to the US. So it's the deterrent effect that is likely to be more effective than actually sending back 100,000 people, simply because it's going to be so expensive.
I was reading the description of one of your papers about the illegal Indians.
Right.
And it was interesting to note that unlike the other illegal immigrants who are coming from the southern border, where the Indian illegal immigrants were primarily coming through Canada.
Well, see, the people who are coming from India, we show, are not poor Indians. People coming from Mexico, Guatemala, they are coming from conflict zones, etc. A large majority are from 2 states, Gujarat and Punjab. They sell their land or they mortgage their land. The average cost is about 50 lakh rupees, which is about $70,000, which is 30 times India's per capita income. So what we wrote in the paper, you have to be rich to come to the US even illegally. You cannot come from India if you're poor illegally taking the US. You have to pay off all sorts of, and it's expensive. So we have seen no evidence of illegal immigration from northern, UP, Bihar, eastern India at all. They're just too poor to even come illegally. You need 2 things. You need cash. Also you need to have access to networks. Because there are a large number of immigrants from Punjab and Gujarat already in the US who have also businesses, it's very easy to integrate into their businesses and hide out there. And so you need both the networks who will offer you and promise you jobs, as well as the ability to finance the journey.
I love the description of the selection premium, because we are not talking about, like you said, these are not apples and oranges. So you are looking at the upper tail, and that migration of that upper tail is necessarily associated with education, and that then with income.
Yeah. And that's the basic story.
Yeah, and that was lovely. That makes perfect sense.
Ready to take questions from the audience?
Yep.
Is that working? Okay, here we go. Dr. Curses?
Okay, thank you. Well, first, my apologies for being late. I was teaching. I very much enjoyed listening to your presentation, and in your data, you did have data for Pakistan as well, in addition to India and China and many other countries. I was wondering if, when you compare the immigration trend from Pakistan and Bangladesh to India, do you see an Indian success in terms of perhaps training their society? So the type of immigrants coming from Pakistan and Bangladesh, are they significantly different from the segment that India sends to the United States? Or is there data on that?
So, I think one of the things, if I don't know if you recall, slide on international students, I had data from Pakistan, and you see it's completely stagnating. India was about 3 or 4 times in 1990s, now it's 30 times. So we do see till about the early 90s, though immigrants coming from Pakistan were also doctors and engineers. But then Pakistan itself has difficulties in creating, building those institutions, and it never really creates a tech sector. But as I showed you, neither Bangladesh nor Pakistan has a tech sector. And the key mechanism of migration after 2000, when the bulk of this takes place, is the tech migration, the H-1B visa, which there are very few from Pakistan or Bangladesh.
Dr. Rahul?
Thank you, Dr. Kapur. This is Starr from engineering. So I wanted to ask a follow-up on your comment that the decline in Ph.D. students from India might be because of the lack of training. So being a faculty here, I have been struggling to recruit Ph.D. students from India. I have from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, very talented students. And but if you see the number of IITs have been growing, other institutions have been growing. So do you think it's because of the opportunities that are available, as you mentioned, and the absence of opportunities in Bangladesh or Pakistan? So essentially, previous generation, the PhDs who were coming were because of the lack of opportunities, and now because there are so many opportunities, they just don't find it that fruitful.
I think that's a very plausible explanation. But we don't have any direct evidence of it other than this plausible. At least anecdotally, we're talking to people there and we ask people why they aren't with PhD. They offer this, they have a very simple response, why? Because they feel they can do tech, this sort of thing in startup scene, etc., around Bangalore and so on. So they don't feel the need for it, right? And they feel they can be globally mobile without coming to the US for a PhD because of this. So, but is that the only reason, or is it also because of the, in principle, because the number of students also going to in engineering has skyrocketed. So it's not, the supply has also increased. And we should have seen a bigger increase. After all, the same story could be said of China, but we haven't seen that as much. So I suspect it's a bit of both, but perhaps a little more on greater opportunities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kapur, for such an informative presentation. I had a follow-up question on the stay rate that you showed in one of the slides. So, I would be interested in knowing the policies on the Indian side as well as the US side that has motivated that trend, and was wondering how it has changed in the last decade, because the data that you showed was until 2014, so how that has changed in the last 10 years.
Kavya, all countries gather excellent data on who comes in. They have very poor data on who leaves. Then they don't care who leaves, but they all want to guard their sovereignty. So the stay rates in the data is not that we know they've stayed. It's the NSF conducts every 5 years of PhD students who are about to finish who are in the final year, and they ask them a question, the likelihood of their stay. So we don't have data of actual stay. So that's what, so they haven't done a survey after that, so that's why it stops there. So it's basically that. It's the only source that we have. Now, many of the tech workers who come, most, I don't want to say most, a large numbers of those do go back, partly because the backlog of green cards for Indians can extend to 100 years. The way you have country quotas and so on. So after 6 years, you sort of max out, H-1B visa cannot be renewed. So many of them go back. But PhD students, because there's an exemption of the quota if you are an academic or a researcher, your ability to stay is greater, and your willingness to stay is greater because, you know, the fact is that the US is a global leader in some research. The facilities, resources you have here are just much, much better. So they are improving in India, but there's no doubt the gap is still large.
Hi, my name is Kishore Venugopal. I'm a faculty at the Department of Finance. Thank you for the presentation. I have a bit of a tangential question related to reason for out-migration. So this is going back to your 2020 paper on why states both fail and succeed at the same time. It was in Journal of Economic Perspectives. And one of the reasons you give is because the local government has been underfunded or it does not have enough resources. So if we compare the local governments with China and the US, one of the things that they do to raise funds and have enough resources is their ability to raise bond financing. India has been trying that for at least the last decade or so, but the market has not yet developed. It's been so underfunded, it's been so difficult. In terms of the policies, and then given that we have studied this, what can be done differently? Because I know Chennai has been trying to do this, and we have been consulting with one of the people sort of Unify, and they have been really struggling in terms of a policy perspective. How can local governments actually shift policies to attract funding for these things? Your thoughts?
So what we're talking about is the way you have municipal finance bonds in the United States. There's a whole rich, deep bond market. Why that has failed to develop in India. I mean, in general, subnational finance, I mean, even if you look at bonds issued by state governments, the big problem is that there's almost no variance in the rates at which and the yields, because they are backstopped by the Reserve Bank and by the federal government. So, if bond financing is unrelated to some measure of financial performance, and the capacity of cities, you know, their own financial capabilities are very limited, that's why it's been a much harder sell. We now see that this finance commission that has been formed is trying to push for at least the metros, beginning with the metros, to have to create a sort of municipal bond market. But even the corporate bond market in India is not as developed. So I think we first need to have that deepened before we see these outcomes at a municipal level. But you're absolutely right, it is much, much needed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kapur. It was a pleasure meeting you last evening and also hearing you this morning. As most Western countries and with the rising nationalistic agenda trying to restrict the immigrant communities, and coupled with the rapid rise in AI and digital globalization, do you anticipate a change in trend for future migrations, especially also taking into consideration that tech has been the most thing for India as well?
I would hesitate to say if I do anything about the future. I'm not sure what I'm going to have for lunch. So, but I think it would be fair to say that you're absolutely right on both counts. We don't know how AI is going to change the nature and demand of tech workers. It's evolving so rapidly in so many ways, and I don't want to claim any expertise in what is going to happen. But it's very plausible, of course, as you said, that it might really reduce the demand for, especially the sort of low-end tech workers. The larger political sentiment of the West protest against immigration, that has undoubtedly become a very salient political issue in virtually every country, including, of course, the United States. But whether it's Germany or every European country, the rise of more hard-right parties is completely linked to immigration. But we have this paradox, right, that the way demographics are going in the West, and not just the West, it's also Korea, Japan, and so on. Countries have no option. I mean, so a paper we are doing is on immigrant workers in farming. So if you ask the question, take a town in Iowa or Nebraska, which young American wants to farm? Which young American wants to work in a poultry factory? Very few. Who wants to harvest, apples or, strawberries in California farms? It is immigrant labor, basically, that's willing to work at such harsh conditions, at such low wages. So, there is this incredible tension between economic needs on the one hand and the iron law of demography versus the sense of the need to preserve one's culture and so on and so forth, and that immigrants are shaping the nature of the nation, what the nation is, and so on. And so I think most countries are caught between a rock and a hard place. Business wants migrants, voters don't. But if your economy begins to tank, I'm sure views will also change. So I think we are at that stop. I think for 300 years, humanity struggled with how to cope with rising populations. This century, we will have to struggle how to cope with declining populations. Right? I mean, just to give you just one number, between India's independence in 1947 and 2025, India added 1.1 billion people to its population. So in 75 years, India added 1.1 billion. From now to 2100, next 75 years, the net increase will be zero. So from 1.1 billion, you will have moved to zero. That's an incredible change. It's very hard for us to really think through what it means and what it will happen. It will have profound effects on politics, on the economy, on all sorts of things. But how should we think through it is, I think, very, very hard.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question.
Thank you, Professor Kapur. The numbers are also a historical story of the evolution of the Indian country. And it has evolved along multiple factors: numbers, occupation, socially, so to say. I also want to know your views in terms of their evolution politically. Both their participation in intensity and scope in political processes in the US, but also in India. If you could comment on that, that would be great. Thank you.
So, when an immigrant comes, right, there is a gap between the time they become legal permanent residents. Then there's a gap between that time that they become citizens. Then there is a gap between the time they become citizens and become registered, voters. then there's a gap between the time they become registered voters and actually go out to vote. So all of these take time. There's a socialization process. This is less, of course, true of those who are born here, but I'm talking immigrants. The data we have is that consistently Indians have been among the most democrat-leaning groups in the US. What we see is that in this last election, all immigrant groups, including Indians, shifted more towards the Republican Party. The majority still voted for the Democrats, but relative to the past, there was a shift. The puzzling part is the shift has occurred more in those born in the US rather than those coming as immigrants. And the shift has occurred most among young men born in the US, somewhat also young women. And we did this survey last October, just before the election. Now, why that's the case, however, we don't have, at least I don't have a good understanding. Is it temporary? Is it permanent? Is this a large shift? But we know this shift is part of a broader shift occurring in the US. So whether it's just flowing with the stream or something specific, I suspect it's the first. It's really the largest shift that you see here as well. In terms of the politics and political attitudes toward India, in our survey, we've identified, we have a paper coming out on a group we call the Modi, the Democrats. They lean left in the US and lean right in India. So they vote for the Democrats and their views are much more liberal, even on specific questions in the United States, than they are in India. Now we argue it is because this group is largely Hindu, that in India they are a majority, so they have majoritarian tendencies. In the United States they are obviously a clear minority, and minorities are much more aware of the precarity and therefore are more liberal to protect their liberties. So that's broadly.
So we can finish the session now. Over to you.
Okay.